Hello everyone, my name is George Zeiderveen. I'm currently a governing board member of Fountain Street Church as well as a committee member of the Duncan Littlefair Speakers Series. Fountain Street Church has had a long history of inviting inspiring speakers to this pulpit. And in 2004, the Duncan Littlefair Great Speakers Series was developed in order to continue that tradition. We've been on hiatus for a number of years, a couple of years now, and we have tentative plans to bring someone live to the pulpit in November, given the COVID turns out okay. But we wanted to provide something, even if it's by YouTube and Zoom, during this time of heightened interest in racism. So we've invited Barry Johnson to be that speaker. I first met Barry around 1970. I was on a fledgling group of board of directors that was establishing a 24-hour crisis telephone hotline. And we somehow came upon him and our board interviewed him. Much to our surprise, after we asked him a bunch of questions, he asked us a bunch of questions. That was unheard of to us, and we learned something about him, and we learned a lot about ourselves. Since then, I've figured this guy, we got to learn a lot from him, and he has a lot to offer. Barry himself graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1965. Shortly after that, he took what's called a secular internship from Union Theological Seminary, and this was in Harlem, New York. While he was there, he soon discovered lots of inequities in various systems and began protesting. He went to lots of protests and soon decided, in addition to protesting what wasn't right, he had an interest in developing systems that were better and able to prevent things that were not right. So he wanted to both protest and develop organizations to prevent oppression. In 1992, his first book, titled Polarity Management, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems, came out. He had discovered that lots of values came in pairs, and each side of the pair was equally valid, and trying to solve problems by picking which one was right didn't seem to work. Therefore, that book. In 2011, he developed and began an organization called Polarity Partnerships, LLC. This was a training and consulting firm that trained and consulted with businesses, government agencies, and various nonprofits. In 2020, just last year, his next book came out called And, Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox, and Dilemmas. Today's presentation will rely on parts of that book. Soon, I think perhaps in the latter part of this year, he will produce the second book, And Volume 2. This will be a collection from a variety of authors from many disciplines, showing how polarity thinking can make a difference in people's lives and in organizations' lives as well. So I invite you to enjoy tonight's presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to Fountain Street Church, located on the ancestral homeland of Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes. Many years ago, one of my mentors, Jack Gibbs, said that to see is to love. If we can see a leaf, a person, an organization, or a nation completely, love is a natural result. Often we have trouble seeing a person beyond something they have done that we don't approve of. If we see someone bullying somebody, we might have difficulty seeing beyond their bullying behavior. They get defined by their worst behavior. We just label them as a bully. To see them completely includes recognizing their bullying and standing against it. This is taking a stand for justice by holding ourselves accountable to stop the bullying and to hold the person accountable for their bullying. And seeing this person completely also involves them seeing them as more than their bullying. They quite likely have been bullied themselves. Regardless of their history, they are a fellow human being who's loved unconditionally by God and is potentially lovable by us. This is known as mercy. Seeing completely is a combination of justice and mercy. Notice the tension between our accountability to stop the bullying and our call to love the bully. I would like to use my mother as an example. If you could have seen my mother completely before she died, you would have loved her. You would know she was raised on a small dairy farm outside a small, all-white town called Rice Lake in northern Wisconsin. She was part of a large family that struggled financially, so she left home at 16 to be a live-in housekeeper for a family in town. She became pregnant with my sister, Beverly, at 17 by my father, whom she then married. She dropped out of school during the pregnancy and never returned. Rather than being seen fully, she spent her pregnancy hiding in my father's parents' home, not wanting to be seen at all. She felt extreme guilt and shame right up to the moment she told me about it 20 years later. If you could see my mother completely, you would see that she is both a girl that got pregnant before marriage, and she was way more than a girl that got pregnant before marriage. She's a young woman who carried this deep shame throughout her life while being a wonderful mother to Beverly, Van, Mindy, and me. She and my dad are accountable for their actions, and they, like you and me, are loved unconditionally by a God who sees us completely. Another view of my mother. When I was 8 years old, I was on a family trip to see my mother's sister and her family in Chicago, 400 miles south of Rice Lake. When we got to Chicago, we stopped at a Texaco gas station to fill up the car. This was a time when a gas station attendant came out and pumped your gas for you and cleaned your windshield while the tank was being filled. Alas, no longer. There were also people working on cars in the service bays of the station. My father was a bulk gas dealer for Texaco, and I would sometimes ride with him in his gas truck as we brought gas to the various Texaco gas stations within 40 miles of Rice Lake. I was very comfortable around gas stations and knew to pay attention to other cars driving up to the pumps to get filled. We had been riding a long time. As soon as our car was stopped at the pumps, I opened the door and jumped out. Before I could get 3 steps away, my mother said to me loudly and firmly, "Barry, get back in the car." I got back in the car, but I was confused. I said, "Why? What's going on?" Mom said, "It's not safe." I looked around, trying to figure out what wasn't safe. Then I knew. The man coming over to pump gas into our car was black. So were the men working on the cars in the service bays in the station. This was the only thing different about this gas station from all the other ones I was so familiar with and that were considered safe. The message was clear. Black people are not safe. This is what cultural racism looks like. She was afraid for my safety, and now I was afraid for my safety. Think of how powerful an attribution it is about a group of people to believe that your child is not safe among them. My mother's fear that we were not safe among black people came from the culture in which she grew up, and I was extending it into another generation. Cultural racism is the result of institutional racism over time. Institutional white racism in the United States shows up as practices and policies that favor white people over black people. One example is black people not having a vote, or if they finally get the vote, laws are written to make it more difficult for black people to vote. This is continuing to happen in many states today. Institutional racism in its many forms leads to a normalization of the inequity, which becomes part of our culture. My mother got her racism, assuming that black people were not safe, by growing up in the United States in a small white town in the middle of a number of small white towns. I got my racism from her without her ever saying directly anything negative about people of color. It was not just her. It was the culture in which we grew up. This culture included the radio, TV, movies, newspapers, our schools, our church, and of course, talking to other white people. One important part of my culture was the conservative Lutheran church I attended religiously from early childhood. In Sunday school, I remember singing, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world." What a great song about loving everyone regardless of color. I believed it then, and I believe it now. Unfortunately, I didn't know any red, yellow, or black children in order to begin seeing them completely. I couldn't see them at all, except for TV and the movies. Not to worry, because the central and most powerful figure in this song was not the children of different colors, but of Jesus who loved them. Fortunately, we had a big picture of Jesus in our sanctuary, so I could see him for myself. Also fortunate for me, he was a white man with light-colored hair who looked a lot like my dad and a lot like me. Who would have guessed that Jesus, born in the Middle East, was a Norwegian? That would be me. So, with these cultural influences as an 8-year-old, it was easy to put these two things together. Black people are unsafe, and Jesus, a white man, is the embodiment of safety, wisdom, and love. Which is the superior choice? It is obvious without anyone having to ever say it. This is just a glimpse into cultural white racism and supremacy in Rice Lake, Wisconsin, and in the United States. Cultural racism is something we absorb by living in a culture in which it exists. All we have to do is live anywhere in the culture, even Rice Lake, Wisconsin, or Grand Rapids, Michigan. So how do we, on the one hand, in the name of justice, take accountability for addressing our tragic history and present reality of racism in the United States, and, on the other hand, in the name of mercy, continue to love our country by seeing it as so much more than the racism within the culture? Thanks for asking. This is the same question I raised at the beginning, at the individual level. How do you stop the bullying and love the bully? There isn't a simple answer. This is a complex, chronic set of issues in which there is polarization and a strong resistance to change. I've been learning about something that can be very useful when dealing with polarization and resistance to change. It is called polarity thinking, or and thinking. It's not a complete answer, but I think it can be very useful in addressing white racism in the United States, in Grand Rapids, in Fountain Street Church, and in ourselves. It's easiest to explain with the help of pictures. I will describe polarities, how they look, how they work, and how and thinking can help us leverage them as a powerful resource for understanding and addressing our racism. So first, I'd like to make a distinction between problems we can solve and polarities that we need to leverage. A problem requires or thinking, and a polarity requires and thinking. So for example, if I was offered a new job, I would have a decision to make. An either or decision to make. Am I going to stay or am I going to leave? If I decide to stay, then I've solved the problem, and I can move on to other problems. So or thinking is required in terms of solving problems. It's required when we're trying to get to the moon, when we're trying to put a highway across the country, when we're trying to build a computer. It's very basic to our life. And or thinking is absolutely essential when we're solving problems. It's even essential in terms of our basic language. So when my grandchildren are very young and we're teaching them words, teaching them language, I point to my ear and I say, "What's this?" And they say, "It's an ear." I point to my nose. "What's this?" "It's a nose." They're making a distinction between the ear and the nose, and they're learning language. They're learning differentiation. In order for any differentiation for science, math, history, or thinking is essential. So or thinking is essential to solving problems, but it's not very useful. Indeed, it's disastrous when we bring or thinking to a polarity. For example, if we think about activity and rest, we need both activity and rest. We can't choose one or the other. I can't just choose to be active for the rest of my life and never get any rest. Polarities are an ongoing interdependency where you need both over time. So we need to connect them with the word and. We need to be active and we need to get some rest. So whenever we deal with a polarity, we need to make sure we're using and rather than or. The other thing to know about a polarity is that it's actually an energy system, a powerful energy system that oscillates around the poles and connects them, and it cuts between them. So the energy system keeps the poles apart, but it also holds them together as a set. So for example, with activity, when we're active, physically and mentally active, we get energized. This is a very good result of activity itself. But activity without rest leads to some bad results. We get burned out. So notice how we can pursue a good thing, but it can lead to bad results without the other good thing that it needs. And that is the good thing of rejuvenation, the upside of rest. So if we're experiencing bad results and we want to move to be rejuvenated, there's a natural progress to do that, a natural self-correction within the polarity. But it's not a problem with a solution. It can look like it, but because being burned out is problematic, and getting rejuvenated by getting some rest is the answer. But it's not an ultimate answer. It's not a solution to a problem over time, because if we overfocus on rest long enough, we start to experience another set of bad results, which is a low energy. So with all polarities, this is what they look like. You have two poles connected by the word and. Each pole has an upside or a good dimension to it. But if you pursue one of those goods to the neglect of the other good, you get bad results. This doesn't make us a bad person if we get those bad results, but it does mean that it can be very harmful to us and to others. What happens when we bring or thinking into the issue of activity and rest, and we say, oh, I've got to choose. Do I choose activity or do I choose rest? If we choose activity and we take, it creates the focus on the energy system now is from the bad results of low energy to the good results of being energized. And this is what we need to do for sure. However, the problem is if we assume that we choose from one or the other and we neglect rest and we don't anymore get the upside of rest, which is to be rejuvenated, it ends up leading to us be caught in the downside of the pole on which we have overfocused. So when we create the false choice between one pole of a polarity and the other, we always get the downside of the pole that we choose, the one we give our energy to, and by neglecting the other one. So I'd like to look now at racism, personal racism, institutional racism, cultural racism in our country. And I'd like to look at it in a way that we can understand how we can get there to these bad results. Racism is a bad result, it's an evil result. How can we get to that evil result without identifying ourselves as inherently evil or our country is inherently evil because there's racism in the country or because of my own racism? An alternative is to pay attention to three key values that we would consider good. The first one is to protect, our desire to protect our family, our organization, or our nation. The second one is to provide. We want to provide for our children, for our family. We want them to have some food on their plate and a roof over their heads. The other is to belong. All of us want to belong to our family or to some group where we can feel at home, accepted, and feel that sense of belonging. these are all good values for sure. What I'm suggesting is that when we pursue them, there are three underlying polarities worth paying attention to. And these three polarities are, one is, in order to protect, we need to pay attention to claiming power and sharing power. In order to provide, we need to pay attention to abundance for some and basics for all. In order to belong, we get invested in the polarity of justice and mercy that I've already talked about a little bit. If we use or thinking when and thinking is required, that's when we get into trouble. So if we look at claiming power without sharing power, that becomes problematic. It leads to dysfunctionality. If we look at abundance for some or basics for all, we create yet another problem that builds on the first. And if we look at justice without mercy, we build on another problem, and so we have these three downsides that occur, these negative results of overfocusing one pole to the neglect of the other. And these three downsides are a root cause and perpetuator of racism. So let's take a look at each of them separately. I want to protect us. Of course, I want to protect my family. I'd like to protect my country. I want to protect our business or our organization. Underneath that desire to protect is a focus on claiming power and sharing power. Now, one of the benefits of claiming power is that if we claim some power, it gives us the power to protect us. The benefit of sharing power is that we can share power to protect them, whoever they are. Another country, another group. We can both claim power to protect us and share power to protect them. But if we focus on sharing power with the neglect of claiming power, we can allow abuse of power over us. If we overfocus on claiming power to the neglect of sharing power, we end up abusing power over them. Now, the difficulty with this polarity, like all polarities, is if we bring or into it, and we assume we have to either claim power or share power. We see power as a zero-sum game. So if there's only 100 dimensions of power, if we have 30 and the other has 70, then what we want to do is bring that more towards our favor. So we want to have power over in order to keep us from being abused by the other. So we've got a fear in this issue, if we see it or thinking, am I going to claim power, or am I going to allow abuse of power over us, over my family, over my country? That drives the energy from the fear of allowing abuse of power over us to claiming power to protect us. Now, I've done some consulting with the U.S. military, and clearly with them, their whole objective is to serve and protect. And so there's a lot of energy that goes into the upside of this pole. As a matter of fact, the United States spends more on defense than the defense budgets of the next 10 countries combined. So there's a lot of energy in going after claiming power, especially if we believe that we can't share it. So what's missing in this picture, where we want to avoid the abuse of power over us, so we're going to claim power to protect us? What's missing is we can share power to protect them. But if we don't think that's possible, if we assume that it's an either-or issue, then we cancel out the notion of sharing power, and we end up not sharing power over them, with them, and what that leads to is an abuse of power over them. So what does this look like in terms of racism in the United States? So my white Western European ancestors from Norway came to the United States, and in the beginnings, we arrive on a land that is occupied by native peoples, a whole continent that's occupied by native peoples. And when we look at this, we need to claim power rather than share power in order to protect. It leads to assuming military power over native peoples. Now, when we have military supremacy, when we win in a war, or we have military supremacy over anyone, we can allow ourselves to assume that that equals supremacy, period. Why did we win? We won because we're better, because we're smarter, because we're more industrious, because we have a better culture, because God's on our side. we can claim all sorts of areas of superiority, of being better, because we won militarily. So that's this is, might makes right is the notion here. And to the victor go the spoils. These kind of quotes have to do with the power that happens when you have military superiority. That showed up in a couple of ways in the early part of white civilization arriving in North America. One of these areas of abuse of power was to take land from native people and put them on reservations. Another was to have people who were free Africans, they're captured, and they arrive in chains and are sold as slaves to work the land. So with this power over, we can both take the land and we can own slaves. I'd like to share, just rather than this language about it, I'd like to share a couple of short quotes to help us describe how really cruel this kind of power over can become. Stop the runaway, Andrew Jackson urged in an ad placed in the Tennessee Gazette in October of 1804. The future president gave a detailed description. A mulatto man-slave, about 30 years old, 6 feet and an inch high, stout-made and active, talks sensible, stoops in his walk, and has an extremely large foot broad across the root of the toes, will pass for a free man. Jackson, who became the country's 7th commander-in-chief in 1929, 25 years later, promised anyone who captured this mulatto black slave a reward of $50 plus reasonable expenses paid. Jackson added a line that I consider particularly cruel. It offered $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. The ad was signed Andrew Jackson near Nashville, the state of Tennessee. Now, in today's terms, financially, this is what it would look like. $50 would be worth over $1,000 today in equivalency. So what he's offering is, in today's finances, $1,000 to return a slave, plus reasonable expenses, plus I will give you $200 for every 100 lashes you give to this recaptured slave, up to 300 lashes for an additional $600. The next quote takes place after Andrew Jackson becomes president. At the beginning of the 1830s, nearly 125,000 Native Americans lived in millions of acres of land in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Florida. Land their ancestors had occupied and cultivated for generations. By the end of the decade, very few natives remained anywhere in the southeastern United States. Working on behalf of white settlers who wanted to grow cotton on the Indians' land, the federal government forced them to leave their homelands and walk thousands of miles to a specially designed Indian territory across the Mississippi River. This difficult and sometimes deadly journey is known as the Trail of Tears. Scott and his troops forced the Cherokee into stockades at Bayonet Point while whites looted their homes and belongings. Then they marched the Indians more than 1,200 miles to Indian territory. Whooping cough, typhus, dysentery, cholera, and starvation were epidemic along the way, and historians estimate that more than 5,000 Cherokee died as a result of the journey. By 1840, tens of thousands of Native Americans had been driven off their land in the southeastern United States and forced to move across the Mississippi to Indian territory. the federal government promised that their new land would remain unmolested forever. But as the line of white settlement pushed westward, Indian country shrank and shrank. In 1907, Oklahoma became a state, and the Indian Territory was gone for good. The Cherokee Nation, to legally claim their power, appealed the plan to remove them from their land to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they won. John Marshall's opinion for the court majority in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia was essentially that Georgia had no jurisdiction over the Cherokees and no claim to their lands. But Georgia officials simply ignored the decision, and President Jackson refused to enforce it. Jackson was furious and personally affronted by the ruling, and he stated, "Mr. Marshall has made the decision, now let him enforce it." This flouting of the Supreme Court was a tragic example of claiming power while denying the Cherokee Nation their legal claim to power. This abuse of power over them undermined the United States constitutional system of government itself. So, this is clearly an example of bullying behavior by the government and by Andrew Jackson. It's very difficult for me to see beyond this bullying behavior. But fortunately, there's an all-loving God who can see beyond this bullying behavior and see Jackson as more than the bully. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to next pay attention to another dimension of this, the downside of over-focusing on claiming power to the neglect of sharing power. The same argument that says we have to claim power without sharing power in the first place leads to the need to maintain it. So after we have claimed the power, we need to, with our power, we write laws in order to maintain our power. For example, you couldn't teach slaves to read. You couldn't teach slaves anything. Why? Because teaching is a form of empowerment. So if you want to claim power without sharing power, no teaching, no learning. At least in any formal education that's legal. Another final point about this, the more inhumane our abuse of power, the more inhumane we must make them. This is both before claiming power over them, during the claiming of power, and afterwards. The more humane we are, the more we must define them as inhuman. For example, we can call ourselves civilized and we call them savages. We can call ourselves enlightened and call them not safe, call them vicious, call them whatever we want because we've got the power to do it. And this allows us to treat them inhumanely in our abuse of power. So the first polarity is claiming power without sharing power because we're bringing or to that polarity. The next one is around providing for us. And when I'm talking about providing for us, I'm talking about the basics. All of us as a parent would like our child to have the basics. We want them to have food, water, and clothing on their back, shelter, education, work at a living wage. We want them to have basic health care, and we'd like them to be safe. Also, it would be great if we had some abundance, if we could be able to live with a degree of relative plentifulness. So, these are understandable, this desire to provide. The polarity that we're looking at underneath this is abundance for some and basics for all. Abundance for some has a great upside. It's a focus on freedom, our freedom to create, entrepreneurial leadership, and to create our abundance. This is terrific. The upside of basics is equal access to the basics for everyone. Now, if we overfocus on basics to the neglect of abundance for some, we can have a loss of freedom and a loss of that abundance. If we overfocus on abundance for some without allowing basics for all, we can have a loss of the basics for many, and gross inequality. Now, if we bring or to this situation, we have either we're going to have abundance for some or we're going to have basics for all. What happens is the either or assumptions makes us afraid that we're going to lose our freedom, especially those who had the power to create abundance for themselves historically in the first place. So we have this abundance and we're afraid of losing our freedom and our abundance. So that is an energy that drives us towards the freedom to create and claim our abundance. So this energy, what happens is we get focused entirely on this dimension with an either-or mindset. What's missing is equal access to basics for all. So what happens is if we claim that we can't have both abundance for some and basics for all, we end up negating the notion of basics for all and its benefits. What does that lead to? It leads to a loss of basics and gross inequality. Now, this gross inequality shows up in the United States as a result of this overfocus on power and overfocus on abundance. So in every category of basics, food, water, clothing, shelter, education, work, healthcare, and safety, blacks experience a disproportionate amount of those basic things. These are the results of institutional slavery, and it's built right into the culture. So let me just give you an example of how this shows up in the area of safety, for example. We often think that, well, things are improving, and I agree, in some ways they really are improving. At the same time, there are areas that are not improving and that are very obstinate in terms of racism in the country. For example, in 1968, if we, proportionally in terms of the size of the black population, size of the white population in our country, black people were more than 5 times as likely to be incarcerated. Black incarceration was 5 times that of white people. Now, this is an impact of racism in our culture, impact in our whole judicial system and incarceration, that would be 5 times. When we look at improvement in various areas around inequality in relation to black people, incarceration is not one that has improved. As a matter of fact, 50 years later, in 2018, the incarceration of black people over white people was more than 6 times, almost 6.5 times. So you are, if black in the United States, 6.5 times as likely to be incarcerated. This is an example of how institutional racism works and how it becomes a part of the culture. We use the fact that more are incarcerated to reinforce the notion that they are not safe, which feeds into the excessive incarceration in the first place. So one final polarity to pay attention to, and that is belonging. All of us want to belong. We want to have a place where we feel comfortable, where we feel belong and accepted and included and welcome. One of the ways that we strive to belong is to obey the law, and laws are important. In all cultures, we have laws. Laws are definitely important, and we need to make sure that we follow them. And if we don't follow them, we need to hold people accountable. This is the polarity then of justice and mercy. So one of the things when we move away from lawlessness and chaos, we can call that evil. We want to avoid the evil of lawlessness and chaos, and we want to move towards something good, where everybody's accountable. So we focus on justice, and our energy is away from lawlessness and chaos and towards being good by making sure that everybody's accountable. Now, if some laws are good, then more laws are better. And laws, so now we get moving, you can tell where this is headed. We're headed towards a lot of laws. Also, laws without consequences are meaningless. So if some consequences are good, then harsher consequences are better. So we're going from lawlessness in our psyche, in our imagination, in our culture, we're going from lawlessness to being law-abiding citizens. And we're increasing the number of laws, and we're increasing the harshness of the punishment. Where is this headed? This pursuit of a good to the neglect of another good becomes cruel. So what's missing is the good side of mercy, which is we recognize that we all are loved and we all belong, period. But if we take out mercy and we lose the benefits of the reality that we're all loved and we all belong, we find ourselves stoning a woman to death for being pregnant out of wedlock. Now, how did we get to this evil result? Is it because the people who are doing the stoning are inherently evil? No, but the stoning itself is definitely evil. That could be my mom there, pregnant out of wedlock, being stoned to death self-righteously by me as another person in another time. So what we need to pay attention to is how pursuing one good to the neglect of the other gets us into some terrible results. So let's take a look at this a little bit further. What are the implications in a culture in which we have a lot of harsh laws and laws with harsh consequences? What happens is, if I can't own my shortcomings, I'll project them on others. And a movie becomes a need for a good projection screen. Now, why can't I own my shortcomings? Because if I owned them, I could be killed. My mother couldn't own her shortcomings. She felt like she couldn't own her shortcomings, so she hid for 9 months from the wrath and potential dismissal by people in Rice Lake. A woman who's pregnant in a culture in which she could be stoned for being pregnant is not going to share that. So what happens with our shortcomings in a highly punitive culture is that we can't own them and need to project them on somebody else. And just saying I didn't do it doesn't work nearly as well as saying I didn't do it, they did it, or she did it. This deflection and projection is something we learn as we grow up. We learn it from our movies, and we learn it from just experience at home. So for example, one day my mother came to me and she said, "Barry, did you take some money from my purse?" And I said, "No, I didn't take money." And it was true, I hadn't taken any money. Now, my mother didn't know whether it was true or not, right? So she's wondering. But my sister came back from the grocery store, a few minutes later. She had taken some money from my mother's purse to get some groceries, brought them back. So it was clear it wasn't me, it was my sister, Beverly. So this is the thing we learn. It's not as convincing to just say I didn't do it. It's much more convincing when we can identify who did do it. So we learn to deflect and project. It's not me, it's somebody else. Now, in order to do that projection, we need a good projection screen. The best projection screen, for me, is someone who's clearly not me. It wasn't me, it was them. So I need to find people who are clearly not me. As a white man, in the two most clearly not me groups are people of color and women. They become the screen on which I can project the worst of myself, the parts I can't own. The focus this evening is on white racism in the United States, but the pattern is very similar for women and sexism on the planet. Note the stoning of a pregnant woman. The stronger the need to project, the stronger the need for a clear screen and to make it clear. So for example, Jews became the projection screen for all the troubles in Germany during the rise of the Nazi Party. But the problem for the Nazi Party was it wasn't really clear who the Jews were. Some you could think maybe were, some you weren't sure. So what they did was required all Jews to wear a Star of David on their outer garments when they went out in public. Now, what was the advantage of this Star of David besides control? besides rounding Jews up, it also gave the Nazi Party a clear projection screen. It's not us, it's them. These are the people we should hate. These are the people we should put in concentration camps. They're not safe, they're not trustworthy. So this is what projection looks like, deflection and projection, and it's done, by the way, in the name of justice. Black people in the United States cannot escape from being a projection screen for white people. They can't just take their Star of David off and hide it and try to walk outside without a star on. So they're really available to a projection screen. If you have the power and you can't own your own stuff as a white man, it's easy to project on people of color. By the way, the blacker the better, because the more obvious it is that they're not me. It is true that white people can also be a projection screen for people of color. The primary difference is in who controls the media and other projection mechanisms in the culture. In the United States, that is primarily white men. So let me just summarize this search for some evil source. I am not an evil person, though I can do racist things. Our country is not an evil country, but we have done and continue to do racist things. So do I. So how do we get at that? How does that happen without assuming that me or my country is inherently evil? This is part of the answer. In our desire to protect, we assume that we can't both claim power and share power, which leads to an abuse of power. We assume that we can't have, in our desire to provide, we assume that we can't have both abundance for some and basics for all. So what happens is we end up using our power and our pursuit of abundance to create gross inequality. In our desire to belong, we pursue justice, and we can't allow for mercy, and that leads to cruelty. This combination of abuse of power, inequality, and cruelty looks like racism. That's the results. So what do we do about this? We can bring "and" to each one of these polarities. We can protect, we can provide, and we can belong. We can do it with "and" thinking. We can both claim power to protect us, and we can share power to protect them. For example, we can both vote, and we can let them have the vote. Who's them? Could be women, could be people of color. We can both claim power and share power. That is doable. When we both claim power and share power, we can also allow for freedom of abundance, and we can have basics for all. We can have our big home, big, wonderful home, that's fine, and we can also provide basic housing for everyone. We can have postgraduate education, like I've had the privilege of having, and we can provide basic education for our kids. We can go out to the best restaurants in the world, and we can make sure that there's basic food on every plate in the country. And finally, we can hold all of us accountable, and we can know that we're all loved. We all belong. We're all accountable, and we all belong. This is important, and the combination of this, protecting us and protecting them, freedom and equality, all are accountable and all are loved. That can help us move towards equity in our country and in our church. So, finally, I want to repeat then, to see is to love. An all-seeing God is an all-loving God. With the justice and mercy polarity, it is within the mercy pole of an unconditional loving God that we can allow ourselves to acknowledge racism as a part of our personal and national history. This love supports us in embracing the justice pole and taking accountability for our part in addressing racism personally and collectively. Just like my mom, each of us and our country is much more than our shortcomings. To see us completely is to love us. You, me, my mom, and our country. In the effort to see ourselves and our country more completely, and thinking can help. We can do what we can to bring justice and mercy to those we already love and to those we have yet to love. All of this is possible because you and I and every leaf, every person, every organization, and every nation is already seen completely and loved. No exceptions. Thank you.